Hi, it's me, the storyteller. Thank you for joining me. Most of my stories on this channel are based on actual events, and some aren't. I'll let you decide if this story is fiction, or if it's not. In the summer of 1924, the rugged slopes of Mount St. Helens bore witness to a tale that would echo through the decades. A story whispered in campfires and chronicled in cryptozoological lore. It was here, amidst the towering pines and shadowed canyons of southwestern Washington, that 5 gold prospectors claimed they came face to face with creatures not of this world. Hulking, hairy beings they would later describe as mountain devils. The men, Fred Beck, Marion Smith, his son Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson, had set up camp beneath a minor peak called Pumice Butte near the Plains of Abraham on the east side of the mountain. They were no strangers to the wilderness and had built a modest log cabin not far from their mining site, which they named the Vander White Claim. Days were spent panning for gold in the nearby streams, while the nights were supposed to offer the peace of the untamed woods. But for an entire week, something out there shattered that peace. As dusk fell each evening, strange sounds echoed through the forest. Deep rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a giant fist against a chest, reverberated in the darkness. Sometimes the silence was broken by shrill whistles coming from different directions, as if in communication. These eerie calls came like clockwork every night, stirring an unease none of the men dared voice aloud. The woods seemed to breathe with something unseen, watching, waiting. Each morning, fresh tracks were found around the cabin, massive, human-like impressions in the dirt, each nearly 14 inches long and pressed deep into the earth as if made by something impossibly heavy. They trailed through the trees, along the springs, and over the canyons, vanishing as mysteriously as they appeared. The men, hardened by frontier life, began carrying their rifles, even for routine chores. They weren't ready to admit fear, but their actions betrayed them. The mysterious encounters escalated one morning during a routine water run. Fred Beck and Marion Smith had set off with their rifles slung over their shoulders, heading for the spring near the cabin. As they approached, Marion suddenly froze and raised his weapon. Across the spring, about 100 yards away, half shadowed beneath a pine, stood a creature straight from a nightmare. It loomed at nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair, with an eerie humanoid posture. Before Fred could react, the creature slipped behind a tree. Then it peeked out. That single moment snapped Marion into action. He fired 3 shots, bark exploding from the trunk where the creature had just stood. But it vanished into the forest. Moments later, it reappeared almost 200 yards away in a small canyon. Fred raised his rifle and took his shot, but Fred hit nothing. The creature melted into the trees once more and wasn't seen again. Rattled, the men hurried back to the cabin. Once the full group had gathered, they held a quick, urgent discussion. Whatever they had seen, or thought they'd seen, was stalking them. There was a sense among them that they had overstayed their welcome in those woods. They agreed to pack up and leave at daylight, but the mountain had other plans. That final night, as darkness wrapped the canyon in a quiet hush, the men tried to get some rest. Around midnight, the calm shattered. Something slammed against the cabin wall with tremendous force, hard enough to shake the structure and knock chinking loose from between the logs. The debris fell onto Marion, waking him in an instant. The men jumped to their feet, rifles in hand, as heavy footsteps circled the cabin. Through the spaces in the logs, they caught glimpses of large, shadowy figures moving in the darkness. 3 of them, at least. Then came the rocks, thudding against the walls, bouncing off the roof, smashing into the door. The unknown creatures began pounding the cabin with their fists, possibly testing it for weaknesses. The men quickly set up firing positions, aiming through the gaps, but held back from taking a shot, hoping the assault would pass, but it didn't. One of the creatures climbed onto the roof. its weight groaning above their heads as it stomped and jumped, trying to break through. Fred and Marion fired their weapons upward, their rifles cracking through the night. After several shots, the creature leapt down and resumed battering the cabin walls. While Fred and Marion defended the roof and walls, Roy, Gabe, and John braced the door. One of the beings had begun throwing its full weight against it, shaking the frame with every blow. The men reinforced the door using planks ripped from a bunk bed and pressed their shoulders against it, their combined weight barely enough to hold it. Suddenly, a long hairy arm forced its way through a gap in the wall where the chinking had fallen away. Its massive hand grabbed an axe, leaning against the cabin's interior. Fred lunged forward and wrestled the handle, preventing it from being pulled outside. Marion aimed his rifle and fired at the creature's arm. It quickly withdrew with a shriek, leaving the axe behind. The siege raged on for nearly 5 hours. Rocks crashed against the cabin, fists pounded relentlessly, and the 5 men, exhausted, terrified, but determined, held the line. Only as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon did the assault subside. One by one, the creatures retreated into the forest, swallowed by the morning mist. When silence finally fell, the men cautiously unbarred the door and stepped outside, rifles still at the ready. In the distance, near the edge of a steep gorge about 80 yards away, Fred spotted one of the creatures. It stood there, watching them. He raised his rifle, fired 3 times, and one shot struck true. The creature stumbled, then disappeared over the edge of the canyon, falling into the 400-foot chasm below. Without hesitation, the men left the area and headed to Spirit Lake, where Marion reported the incident to a local ranger. From there, they returned to Kelso, Washington, shaken but alive. Word of their ordeal slowly leaked to the press, and soon the story caught fire. Reporters, thrill seekers, and curious hunters descended upon the newly christened Ape Canyon, hoping for a glimpse of the great hairy apes. As the years passed, the story of the Ape Canyon Encounter took on a life of its own, mutating into sensational headlines and half-remembered campfire retellings. The legend of Ape Canyon didn't end with the 1924 encounter. In fact, it only deepened. Nearly 30 years later, in 1950, Mount St. Helens once again whispered its secrets through the unexplained disappearance of a man named Jim Carter. Carter, a skilled skier and experienced mountaineer, had set off with a group from the Portland Mountain Club for a weekend excursion near the same treacherous canyons once haunted by Fred Beck and his crew. After posing for a photograph at a lookout point, Carter volunteered to ski down the mountain alone and take a picture of the group as they skied down to Timberline. That was the last time that anyone saw Carter. A search was launched immediately. The next morning, searchers found a discarded film box at the point where he had taken a picture. What they discovered defied logic and stirred old fears. Carter's ski trail, which began as a routine descent, suddenly veered into chaos. His tracks cut sharply through the trees, careening over steep embankments and plunging into dense timber. To the trained eyes of the rescuers, it appeared not like a man skiing, but fleeing. Despite days of scouring the slopes and deep canyons, no trace of Carter was ever found. No body, no equipment, nothing but those frantic tracks. The searchers, many of whom were seasoned mountaineers, described a heavy, unsettling feeling during their time in the canyon. Some refused to ever return. According to a Longview Washington Times article in August of 1963, Bob Lee, a well-known Portland mountaineer who was a member of the exclusive Worldwide Alpine Club, a leader of the 1961 Himalayan expedition, and advisor to the 1963 American expedition, said, "Carter's complete disappearance is an unsolved mystery to this day. Quote, that there was something strange on the high slopes of that mountain. He was convinced of this during the search for Carter. Quote, Dr. Otto Trott, Lee Stark, and I finally came to the conclusion that the mountain devils got him," said Lee seriously. Lee said that he had never seen one of the monsters, but that there certainly was evidence. Lee, a member of the Seattle Mountain Search and Rescue Unit at the time, described the hunt for Carter in Ape Canyon as, quote, "the most eerie experience I've ever had." He said that every time he got cut off from the rest of the searchers during the long hunt, he got the feeling that, quote, "somebody was watching me." He went on to say, "I could feel the hair on my neck standing up. It was eerie. I was unarmed except for my ice axe, and believe me, I never let go of that." The article went on to note that Carter evidently took off down the mountain in a wild, death-defying dash, quote, "taking chances that no skier of his caliber would take, as if someone or something was chasing him," said Lee, who was one of the first searchers to reach Carter's ski tracks. Quote, "He jumped over 2 or 3 large crevasses and evidently was going like the devil," end quote. When Carter's tracks reached the precipitous sides of Ape Canyon, the searchers were amazed to see that Carter had been in such a hurry that he went right down the steep canyon walls, but they did not find him at the bottom of the canyon as they expected. Quote, "We combed the canyon one end to the other for 5 days. Sometimes there were as many as 75 people in the search party, but no sign of Carter or his equipment was found," said Lee. After 2 weeks, the search was called off. Lee, who lived in the Northwest most of his life, recalled that there were about 25 different reports of people attacked by, quote, "ape-like men" in the St. Helens and Cascade areas over a 20-year period. For many, the Jim Carter incident was more than a tragic accident. It was a warning, a reminder that something ancient and unseen may still inhabit the deep gorges and forests of Mount St. Helens. For Fred Beck, still alive at the time, it served as a haunting validation. Long after the headlines faded and skeptics dismissed the encounter as folklore or fabrication, Fred Beck refused to remain silent. He maintained that what he experienced in Ape Canyon was real, and more than just physical. In 1967, he self-published a small but profound book titled "I Fought the Apemen of Mount St. Helens," a slim, obscure pamphlet that slipped under the radar of mainstream media. But within its pages, Beck delivered a version of the event that was far stranger and perhaps far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. According to Beck, the creatures that attacked the cabin were not simply undiscovered animals, nor wild men of the woods. In his eyes, they were something far more complex, beings from another plane of existence. He believed the so-called Apemen were manifestations of energies, interdimensional entities, drawn to places of psychic resonance, like the wilderness surrounding Mount St. Helens. He described the canyon as a spiritual hotbed, a location where reality's thin veil occasionally parted. As it turns out, Fred Beck wasn't just a miner, he was a mystic. In the years leading up to the incident, he had studied metaphysical thought, Eastern spirituality, and Western mysticism. He wrote that during their time in the canyon, he and Marion Smith had engaged in psychic meditation and mind projection, attempting to manifest inner truths through focused thought. Beck would later speculate that these mental experiments may have acted as a beacon, drawing attention not only from hidden forces of the earth, but possibly from beings that existed just beyond the edges of normal perception. To him, the attack wasn't random. It was a reaction, perhaps even a form of cosmic feedback. He described the Apemen not as simple beasts, but as conscious entities capable of telepathic communication. Though primal in form, they were intelligent, aware, and filled with a purpose beyond comprehension. Tragically, 13 years later, in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted in one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in U.S. history. 57 people lost their lives, and the ash cloud, mudslides, and partial collapse of the mountain's northern flank obliterated the area completely. The site of the old cabin, along with any remaining evidence of the encounter, was buried beneath molten rock, mud, and ash, lost to time. But not everything may have been buried forever. In the years following the eruption, whispers began to circulate, rumors that pointed to something far stranger than downed trees and scorched earth. According to a handful of locals and researchers, the U.S. military had quietly mobilized to the devastated region, not just for rescue and recovery, but for something far more secretive. Multiple accounts claim that National Guard helicopters were spotted hauling away large, tarp-covered cargo from the remote regions near Ape Canyon. Some witnesses spoke of convoys moving through the area at odd hours, heavily secured and operating under tight radio silence. Most curious of all were the murmurs that circulated among emergency crews and loggers. Rumors that strange ape-like bodies had been discovered in the carnage, partially buried beneath fallen trees and ash near the canyon rim. These claims were never officially acknowledged. No photographs, no documents, no public statements ever confirmed them. But for those who believe in the truth behind the Ape Canyon Encounter, the absence of proof only deepened the mystery. Some suggest the creatures killed in the eruption were quickly recovered by military forces and removed for study. Others claim the government had known about the presence of the beings for years, even before the eruption, but used the opportunity to cover their tracks. Literally. The men who survived that strange night in 1924 are all gone now, their voices silenced by time. But the legend they left behind lives on in the shadow of Mount St. Helens. And for those who look closely enough at the mountain's history, some believe the truth is still there, hiding just beneath the surface. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give it a like, a comment, and maybe a share. But if you didn't like the story, maybe share it with someone you don't like. In any case, I'm glad you stuck around to the end.